In a kingdom built on lies, her innocence was a death sentence. When her noble father was dragged away in chains, branded a traitor, Lady Elara was stripped of her name and her future. Her sentence was not a swift execution, but a fate many considered far worse. She was to be offered as a living tribute to the one man the kingdom truly feared, the reclusive, monstrous king. They called him the Beast, a ruler so disfigured by the horrors of war that he hid his face from the world, consumed by silent rage. Everyone who watched her being led to his forgotten castle wing expected her to be torn apart or left to rot. Her enemies smirked, certain their cruel plan was complete. But when she was finally thrown before the throne in the shadows, the Beast King did something no one could have predicted. He chose not to destroy her, but to protect her. The marble of the throne room was cold enough to steal the breath, a vast, echoing chamber where giants of history had decided the fates of nations. But today, it felt like a tomb. For Lady Elara, it was the place where her world ended. It did not end with a roar, but with the sickening scrape of iron chains against the polished floor. Her father, Duke Gregor, a man whose back had never bent to any but his king, was forced to his knees. His face was bruised, his silver hair matted with sweat, but his eyes still held the fire of a proud and honorable man. He did not look at his accusers. He looked at Elara, a silent message of strength passing between them, a final gift from a father to his daughter. Standing before the empty throne was Lord Valerius. His robes were the color of spilled wine, rich and decadent, and his smile was a sharp, cruel line in his perfectly composed face. He held a scroll in his hands, not as a symbol of justice, but as a weapon. His voice, smooth as oiled leather, filled the cavernous hall, each word a stone cast at her family's name. "The evidence is undeniable," Valerius announced, his eyes sweeping across the gathered council members, a silent warning to any who might dare to object. "Duke Gregor, first counselor to the king, has conspired against the very crown he swore to protect. He plotted to usurp the throne, to plunge this kingdom into chaos for his own gain." A lie. Every word was a venomous lie. Elara stood frozen near a pillar, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She could feel the stares of the court, the whispers that slithered through the air like snakes. Yesterday these same people had bowed to her. Today they looked at her as if she were a contagion, the daughter of a traitor. Her father was the most loyal man in the kingdom, a friend to the old king and a steadfast believer in his heir, the scarred and reclusive King Theron. The Duke tried to speak, his voice hoarse. "Valerius, you know this is false. I demand to speak to the king himself." Valerius let out a soft, pitying chuckle. The king does not trouble himself with the squirming of traitors. He has entrusted this council to render his justice. And we have. He unrolled the scroll with a dramatic flourish. The silence in the room was so absolute, Elara could hear the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. For his crimes of high treason, Duke Gregor will be stripped of his titles and lands and confined to the black cells to await his final judgment, Valerius declared. A collective gasp rippled through the court. The black cells were a death sentence, a place of darkness and despair from which no one returned. Elara felt a cry catch in her throat, but she choked it down. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Her father's eyes found hers again, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Be strong." But Valerius was not finished. A sinister light danced in his eyes as he looked directly at Elara, his smile widening. He was enjoying this, savoring every moment of their destruction. And as for his daughter, Valerius continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, drawing everyone in. "A traitor's blood cannot be allowed to fester within this court. However, the king, in his wisdom, has decreed a fate more fitting than execution, a way for her to serve the crown she and her father sought to undermine." He paused, letting the tension build until it was a physical thing, pressing down on Elara's shoulders. "She will be delivered to the king's private residence, a living tribute to his eternal vigilance." She will serve him in whatever capacity he sees fit for the remainder of her days. If the first sentence had been a shock, this one was an earthquake. A wave of murmurs and horrified gasps swept the room. The king's private residence. No one called it that. It was the beast's wing, the forgotten corner of the castle where King Theron had locked himself away after the war, a place shrouded in terrifying rumors. They said he was a monster, his face a ruin of melted flesh and fury. They said his heart was as scarred as his skin, that he was prone to fits of violent rage. No servant sent to his wing had been heard from again. To be given to him was not a service. It was a sacrifice. Valerius was sending her to be devoured, to be broken by a man the entire kingdom believed was a monster. It was a sentence more cruel, more personal than a clean death. It was a slow, terrifying descent into madness. Two guards, their faces grim and impassive, broke away from the wall and began walking towards her. The reality of her fate crashed down upon her. This was real. Her father was being dragged away to a dungeon, and she was being handed over to a ghost story made flesh. Her entire world had been dismantled in a matter of minutes by one man's ambition. Her father roared, a sound of pure fury and desperation, fighting against his chains. "No, Valerius, you will not do this. Leave her out of it." The guards slammed him back to his knees. Lord Valerius simply watched, his expression one of perfect triumph. Elara's legs felt like stone, but she held her head high. As the guards reached for her arms, she did not look at them. She did not look at the gloating face of her family's destroyer. She locked eyes with her father one last time, her expression a silent vow. She would not break. She would survive. This was not the end. As the heavy oak doors of the throne room closed behind her, shutting her off from the life she had known, a cold dread unlike any she had ever felt settled over her. She was now a creature of the shadows, walking towards the den of the beast, and every step echoed with a single, terrifying question. What kind of monster was she about to meet? The journey to the king's wing was a walk through a dying world. The guards led Elara away from the vibrant heart of the castle with its bright tapestries, roaring fires, and bustling courtiers, into corridors that grew progressively darker and more silent. Dust motes danced like ghosts in the thin shafts of light from grime-covered windows. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things. The portraits on the walls were of a happier time, of a royal family smiling under a golden sun, now veiled in shadow and neglect. It felt as if she were walking into the pages of a ghost story. They finally stopped before a set of immense, iron-banded doors, guarded not by the royal guard in their gleaming silver armor, but by two hulking men clad in black leather, their faces as hard and unforgiving as stone. Lord Valerius was waiting for them, a small, cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was accompanied by a handful of his closest allies, their eyes gleaming with a morbid curiosity. They were here for the final act of the spectacle, to see the traitor's daughter delivered to the monster. "Present the tribute," Valerius commanded, his voice echoing unnaturally in the dead silence. One of the black-clad guards pulled open the heavy door, revealing a hall so dark it seemed to swallow the light from the corridor. Elara was shoved forward, stumbling into the oppressive gloom. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound like a final judgment. She was in an antechamber, empty save for the thick carpets of dust. At the far end, another set of doors stood closed, these carved from dark, ancient wood. This was the entrance to the throne room of the beast. She did not have to wait long. With a low groan of unused hinges, the great wooden doors swung inward, seemingly of their own accord. The room beyond was vast and steeped in shadow. A single throne, more a block of jagged stone than a seat of royalty, sat upon a raised dais, and on it a figure. It was too dark to see a face, only a silhouette, broad and motionless, a king of shadows. Valerius and his retinue stepped into the room behind her, their purpose clear. They were here to witness her end. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice oozing a false reverence that made Elara's skin crawl. "We bring you a gift, a symbol of your council's unwavering loyalty, the daughter of the traitor, Duke Gregor, given to you as a tribute. May she serve as a reminder that all who conspire against you will be broken." He gave Elara a slight push, forcing her to take a few steps closer to the dais. She kept her back straight, her chin up. She was terrified, but she would not show it. She would not give him that final victory. She fixed her eyes on the figure on the throne, waiting. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the silhouette moved. The figure rose slowly, deliberately from the throne. He was taller than she had imagined, and broader. As he descended the steps of the dais and walked into a faint beam of moonlight cutting through the gloom, the court behind her let out a collective, horrified gasp. The rumors had not done him justice. They had not been cruel enough. One side of King Theron's face was the man he must have been, a strong jaw and a noble brow. But the other side was a ruin of melted, twisted flesh, the skin pulled taut over his skull in a permanent, agonizing snarl. The scar tissue ran down his neck and disappeared beneath the collar of his high black tunic. One of his eyes was clear and sharp, a startling ice blue. The other was clouded, milky white. He was not just a scarred man, he was a king who had walked through the heart of a dragon's fire and brought part of it back with him. He was the beast. Valerius's smirk widened. This was what he had wanted. The court was terrified. The monster was revealed. He expected a roar, a violent outburst, an act of rage that would seal Theron's reputation forever and prove him unfit to rule. But the king did not roar. He did not even look at Valerius. His piercing blue eye and the clouded one beside it were fixed solely on Elara. He walked until he stood just a few feet from her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, see the faint tremor in his scarred hand. He was not a cold monster. He was a man in constant pain. She met his gaze, her fear warring with an unexpected surge of defiance. She had faced the liars in the court. She would face the monster in the darkness. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, King Theron did something that no one, least of all Lord Valerius, could have predicted. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in the depths of his one good eye, she saw not rage, but a flicker of something else, recognition, understanding. Then he lifted his head and gave a single, sharp, authoritative nod. It was an acceptance, a claim. Without a word, he turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Lord Valerius and the stunned courtiers. He raised his scarred hand and made a sharp, dismissive gesture, a clear, unspoken command. Leave. The authority in the gesture was absolute, more powerful than any shouted order. It was the command of a true king, one who had not forgotten his power, but merely let it sleep. The courtiers, including a dumbfounded Valerius, had no choice but to obey. They backed away, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear, and scurried out of the throne room. The great doors boomed shut once more, plunging the room back into near total darkness. Elara was left alone, her heart pounding, standing before the silent, terrifying king who had just saved her. In that moment she was no longer a tribute to be broken. She was a ward to be protected. The most powerful man in the kingdom had just drawn a line in the sand, placing her on his side of it. He had defied the man who ruined her life without ever speaking a word. The fate of an entire kingdom can change in a single, silent moment. This was one of them. If you believe that true strength is not shown in words, but in the courage to protect the innocent, subscribe now. You will not want to miss what happens when the beast decides to fight back. The moment the heavy doors sealed her in with the king, Elara's defiant courage evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating fear. The beast of the rumors had been a terrifying fantasy. The silent, wounded man before her was a terrifying reality. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood in the gloom, a statue carved from shadow and pain. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by her own ragged breathing. Then, without a backward glance, King Theron turned and walked away. He did not dismiss her or acknowledge her further. He simply disappeared into the deeper darkness of the hall, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the stone floor, the sound echoing long after he was gone. Elara was left standing alone in the vast, empty throne room, a ghost in a dead king's court. Had he forgotten her already? Was this his plan, to leave her here to waste away in the darkness? A faint sound made her flinch. One of the silent, black-clad guards had entered from a side door she hadn't noticed. He was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of indifference. He did not speak. He simply crooked a finger, a silent command for her to follow. With no other choice, she did, her own footsteps feeling small and timid in the wake of the king's. He led her through a maze of cold, empty corridors. There were no servants here, no life. Every torch sconce was empty, every doorway a gaping mouth of darkness. This was not just a neglected wing of the castle. It was a mausoleum. He finally stopped before a simple wooden door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter. The room was her prison. It was impeccably clean but stark and bare. A narrow bed with a thin wool blanket, a small wooden table with a matching chair, and an empty wardrobe were the only furnishings. A single tall window, its glass wavy and distorted, looked out not upon the castle grounds but into a small, high-walled courtyard. It was a dead garden, choked with thorns and withered vines, a perfect reflection of the world she had just entered. The guard placed a pitcher of water and a single candle on the table, then retreated, closing the door behind him. The click of the lock was the loudest sound she had heard since entering the king's domain. It was the sound of her cage being sealed. Elara sank onto the edge of the bed, the thin mattress crinkling beneath her. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a presence, a physical weight that pressed in on her, filling her lungs and choking her thoughts. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She had been saved, she told herself. The king had defied Lord Valerius. He had protected her. But as the hours of the night crept by, that single act of defiance felt less like a rescue and more like a transfer of ownership. She had been Valerius's pawn. What was she now? The beast's pet? His prisoner? She lit the candle, the small flame pushing back a pathetic circle of darkness. In the flickering light, the room seemed even more like a cell. There was nothing of her old life here, no books, no embroidery, no comfort. She was stripped of everything that made her Elara. Here she was just the tribute. Sleep would not come. Every creak of the old castle made her jump. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she heard it again. The king's footsteps pacing the stone hall outside her room, heavy, dragging. The sound of a man carrying an impossible weight. It went on for hours, a restless, tormented march. She found herself holding her breath, listening. Was he angry? Was he in pain? The rhythmic, unending sound was more frightening than any roar could have been. It spoke of a mind that knew no peace, a soul trapped in a labyrinth of its own suffering. This was the man who held her life in his hands. Had she traded one cage for another? Valerius's cage had been made of lies and political ambition, but at least it was in the world of the living. This new cage was built of silence, grief, and shadows. As the first pale gray light of dawn filtered through the grimy window, it brought no hope, only a clearer view of her desolation. The king's footsteps had ceased. The castle was once again deathly still. Elara had survived her first night, but a terrifying uncertainty had taken root in her heart. She was alive. She was protected, for now. But she was trapped in a silent world with a broken king. She had no purpose, no instructions, no idea what he wanted from her. The day stretched before her, an empty expanse of time to be spent in this barren room, waiting, for the beast to emerge from the shadows again, and she had no idea what would happen when he did. The days that followed bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, painted in shades of gray and silence. Elara's life settled into a quiet, lonely routine. She would wake in her cold room, eat the meager meal of dry bread and watery broth left by the silent guard, and then spend the long hours staring out at the dead garden, a prisoner in a forgotten tower. The king remained a ghost, a heavy footstep in the hall at night, a fleeting shadow she sometimes glimpsed from her window. He never spoke to her, never summoned her. The brief moment of defiance in the throne room felt like a dream. Her hope began to fray. She was safe from Valerius, but she was withering in this profound isolation. The silence was no longer just heavy, it was starving her. Then, one evening, something changed. Outside her door, placed on the cold stone floor, was a tray. It was not the usual gruel. A ewer, small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, sat next to a wedge of sharp white cheese and a glistening red apple. It was simple food, but it was real. It was the kind of food one would give to a guest, not a prisoner. Elara stared at it, her heart thudding. The silent guard would never have done this. There was only one other person in this entire wing of the castle, the king. The thought was bewildering. He had noticed her. He had seen the pathetic meal she was given and had intervened, silently from a distance. She carried the tray into her room, and as she ate the bread, its warmth spreading through her, she felt the first flicker of something other than fear. It was a strange and fragile gratitude. This small act emboldened her. She could not simply wait in her room to die of loneliness. The next day she ventured out, exploring the silent corridors near her chamber. She discovered a library, its shelves groaning under the weight of books thick with dust. It was a treasure. Trove of knowledge, abandoned and neglected. It was a reflection of the king himself. With no tools, she used a scrap of her own worn tunic to begin cleaning. She started with a single shelf, wiping the dust from each leather-bound spine, carefully restacking the volumes, bringing a small pocket of order to the chaos. It was painstaking work, but it gave her a purpose. It was a way to fight back against the decay that surrounded her. It was her own silent message. I am still here. I will not let your world crumble. One afternoon, as she was organizing a section on military history, a voice startled her. Well, well, the traitor's whelp has been allowed to roam. Elara turned to see a slick, perfumed courtier leaning against the doorway. It was Lord Fenton, one of Valerius's most loyal sycophants. His smile was predatory. Lord Valerius sends his regards, Fenton said, sauntering into the library. He is concerned for your well-being, worried the king's melancholic state might prove an unhealthy environment for a delicate lady. The threat was clear. He took another step closer. Perhaps you would be better served back in the main castle, under his protection. Elara backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trapped. And then the temperature in the room dropped. Lord Fenton froze, his cruel smile wiped clean from his face. Elara followed his terrified gaze to the far end of the library. King Theron was standing there, shrouded in the shadows as always. He had not made a sound. He simply was. He did not look at Elara. His eyes, one of ice, one of milk, were fixed on Lord Fenton. He said nothing. He did nothing but stand there and breathe. The sheer weight of his presence, the silent, concentrated rage emanating from him, was more terrifying than any drawn sword. Lord Fenton, who had been so bold moments before, now seemed to shrink. He stammered a hasty apology, bowed so low he nearly fell over, and practically fled from the room. The king remained for a moment longer, his gaze still fixed on the doorway where Fenton had disappeared. Then, as silently as he had arrived, he turned and was gone, leaving Elara with the scent of ozone in the air. He had protected her again. He had appeared from the shadows like a guardian beast, driven off the jackal, and returned to his lair, all without a single word passing between them. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not just survive in this place, she would make it her own. Her eyes went to the dead garden outside her window. The next day she found an old, rusted trowel in a forgotten storage closet and forced open the creaking gate to the courtyard. The garden was a tangled ruin of thorns and weeds, but in the center, just as she had seen, was a single rose bush. It was gnarled and choked, but it was alive. She spent hours, then days, clearing the space around it, her hands raw and bleeding. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, and cleared the thorns, focusing all her energy on this one living thing. It was her answer to his protection. He shielded her from the dangers of the court. She would shield this small piece of his world from death. They were two broken souls, speaking to each other in a language of their own invention, a language of warm bread and clean books, of silent protection and the patient nurturing of a single stubborn rose. In the crushing silence of the castle, a fragile trust was beginning to grow. Weeks turned into a month, and the oppressive silence of the king's wing began to change its nature. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the quiet of a sanctuary. A strange, unspoken rhythm now governed their days. Elara would wake to find a tray of wholesome food outside her door. She would spend her mornings bringing order to the forgotten library, and her afternoons coaxing life back into the walled garden. The single rose bush now had small green buds, tight fists of promise against the thorns. The king remained a creature of the periphery, a shadow in a doorway, a presence she felt before she saw him. He was her unseen guardian, her silent benefactor. The fear she once felt had been replaced by a deep, gnawing curiosity. She had seen his power and his unexpected gentleness. She had felt his protection, but the man himself remained a mystery, locked away behind his scars and his silence. She found herself wondering less about the monster and more about the man who had been lost inside it. One night, a storm raged outside the castle walls, rattling the window of her chamber. Sleep was impossible. A restless energy filled her, a need to escape the confines of her room. Carrying a single candle, she slipped into the corridor. The king's heavy footsteps were absent tonight. The storm seemed to have swallowed all other sounds. She wandered further than she ever had before, drawn down a hall she had previously avoided. At its end was a heavy oak door, intricately carved, unlike the others. It was ajar, and from within, a soft, flickering light spilled into the corridor. It was the only light she had seen in this wing, besides her own candle and the distant moonlight. Hesitantly, she approached, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone. She peered through the gap. It was a small, private chapel. The air inside was still and smelled of cold stone and beeswax. It was not grand, but simple, a place for private reflection rather than public worship. King Theron was inside. He was not praying. His back was to her, and he stood before a small marble altar to the side, away from the main dais. The candlelight softened the harsh lines of his scarred back and neck. He was utterly still, his focus entirely on something she could not see. Driven by an irresistible urge to understand, Elara crept closer, hiding in the deep shadows just outside the doorway. From this new angle, she could see what held his attention. It was a statue, not of a deity, but of two young boys, sculpted from pure white marble with breathtaking skill. The older boy stood tall and proud, his arm resting protectively on the younger's shoulder. His face, unmarred and handsome, was full of youthful confidence. It was unmistakably a younger King Theron. The second boy was smaller, perhaps only 10 years old, and he was laughing, his head tilted back as he looked up at his brother with an expression of pure, unadulterated hero worship. As Elara watched, Theron slowly raised his unscarred hand. It trembled slightly as he reached out, not to the statue of himself, but to the smaller figure, with a tenderness that seemed impossible for such a large and broken man. He gently, reverently, traced the curve of the laughing boy's cheek. The gesture was so full of love, so heavy with a grief that was ancient and bottomless, that it stole the air from Elara's lungs. The beast was gone. The fearsome king was gone. In his place was only a man, standing before the ghost of a memory, his shoulders slumping under a weight she could not comprehend. And as she watched him, the truth of his prison was finally revealed. This was Prince Liam, his younger brother, the brother who had died in the fire that had given Theron his crown and his scars. The laughing boy in the statue was the one Theron had walked through flames to save, and failed. The scars on his face were not just marks of a battle with an enemy. They were a map of his own personal hell. Each twist of flesh was a reminder of his failure, of the moment he had lost the one person who looked at him like he was a hero. He was not hiding from the world because he was a monster. He was hiding from himself. His silence was not born of rage, but of a guilt so profound it had stolen all of his words. Elara's heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming empathy. All this time she had seen him as her captor, her savior, a figure of power and fear. But now she saw the truth. He was the prisoner. This silent wing of the castle was not his kingdom. It was his cell, and he was both the captive and the warden. She quickly and silently backed away, her own sorrow mirroring his. She retreated down the dark corridor, the image of his gentle hand on the cold marble seared into her mind. She finally understood. She was not trapped in a cage with a beast. She was sharing a quiet solitude with a man who was drowning. And for the first time, she felt not fear, but a fierce, desperate desire to see him breathe again. The passing weeks wove a delicate tapestry of peace in the forgotten wing of the castle. The silence between Elara and the king was no longer an empty void, but a shared space filled with unspoken understanding. One morning, Elara went to the garden and found that the first rosebud had opened. It was a deep, velvet crimson, a defiant splash of life against the gray stone walls, a perfect secret shared between her and her silent guardian. For the first time since her father's arrest, she felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps, she thought, two broken things could indeed help each other heal. This fragile peace was shattered by the sound of determined footsteps and loud, authoritative voices echoing from the main corridor. It was a sound of the outside world, the world of politics and lies, and it felt like a violation. Elara rushed out of the garden to see Lord Valerius, flanked by 2 members of the King's Council and a contingent of the Royal Guard, marching toward the King's throne room. They had not been stopped. They had come with an authority that even the King's sentinels could not deny. Theron was already there, standing at the foot of his stone throne, as if he had been expecting this intrusion. He was a dark, unmoving mountain in the center of the room. Valerius strode in, his eyes alight with triumph. He had cornered the beast at last. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, the respect in his tone thin and sharp, like a pane of ice about to crack. "Forgive this intrusion, but a matter of grave urgency has arisen, which requires your immediate attention. A matter of treason that strikes at the very heart of the kingdom." He held up a sealed letter. "We have found new evidence in the case of the traitor Gregor, a confession of a sort." He unsealed the letter with a flourish and began to read. The words he spoke were poison, a skillfully crafted fiction of Elara's devotion to her father's cause, her supposed resentment of the king, and her part in a vile plot to see him overthrown. It was a masterpiece of lies, painting her as a cunning viper hiding in the king's shadow. Elara had followed them into the room, and she stood frozen, listening to this grotesque perversion of the truth. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was his checkmate. "The letter is signed by her own hand," Valerius finished, his gaze falling on Elara with feigned pity. "It seems the traitor's daughter is more like her father than we knew." He then turned back to the silent king. "The council is in agreement. For the safety of the realm, the traitor Gregor must be executed at sunrise. And the girl? She must be delivered to us for immediate questioning. We must know the full extent of her conspiracy." Questioning. The word hung in the air, a euphemism for the dungeons, for the cold iron of the torturer's tools. It was a death sentence, but one preceded by unimaginable pain and humiliation. Valerius had not come for justice. He had come to destroy the last piece of Duke Gregor's legacy, and to finally break the reclusive king. Any action Theron took would be a loss. If he released her, he was weak. If he fought for her, he was an unstable monster proving Valerius's point. The fragile peace they had built, the silent understanding, the hope of the single red rose, it was all about to be burned to the ground. As the shadow of the past returned to destroy everything, the silent king would have to do more than just leave warm bread at her door to save her now. If you believe a did. Man's true strength is measured by how he protects the one he loves. Subscribe so you don't miss the battle that is to come. Elara looked at Theron. His scarred face was unreadable, but she could see the corded muscles in his neck, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. A storm was raging within him. She saw the beast, the warrior, fighting to be unleashed. But she also saw the king, the strategist, who knew this was a trap. Before he could act, Elara found her own voice. It did not tremble. "You are a liar," she said, her words clear and cold in the silent room. She looked not at the king, but directly into Lord Valerius's surprised eyes. "You forged that letter, just as you forged the evidence against my father. You have built your career on a throne of lies, and one day it will collapse upon you." Valerius laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Brave words from a cornered snake. Your defiance changes nothing. Your Majesty, the council awaits your decision. Hand her." "Over!" All eyes turned to the king. The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from explosion. Theron's gaze moved from Valerius to Elara. She stood tall, unafraid, her trust in him absolute and terrifying. She had placed her life entirely in his hands. He could not fail her. Not again. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The council members flinched. For a terrifying second, Elara thought he would lash out, that the beast would finally win. Instead, his voice, rough and deep from disuse, but utterly steady, filled the hall. It was the first time he had spoken in front of the council in years. "You will have your justice, Lord Valerius," the king said, his one good eye like a chip of ice. "The girl will be questioned." A wave of relief washed over Valerius's face, quickly replaced by a triumphant smirk. He had won. "But not by you," the king continued, his voice dropping, each word a stone of finality. "She will be questioned by me, here. She is my tribute, my responsibility. You will have your answers in the morning." He turned his gaze on the council members, a silent command that dared them to defy him. None did. He was their king, a fact they had conveniently forgotten. Valerius's face contorted in a mask of fury. His perfect plan had been foiled by a single, quiet command. He had been dismissed, his authority rendered meaningless. He had no choice but to bow stiffly and retreat, his entourage trailing behind him like beaten dogs. The doors slammed shut, leaving Elara once again alone with King Theron. But this time everything was different. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was a blade hanging over both of their heads, set to fall at sunrise. They had until dawn to unravel a conspiracy and save their lives. The silence was finally irrevocably broken. The moment the heavy doors closed, sealing them in, the manufactured calm of King Theron shattered. He turned from the door, and for the first time, Elara saw the full fury of the warrior he kept chained within. It was not in a roar or a thrown object, but in the blazing intensity of his one good eye and the restless energy that suddenly radiated from him. He paced the length of the throne room once, his uneven footsteps a frantic, caged rhythm. The beast was awake, and it was demanding justice. He stopped before her, the silence between them now charged with urgency. He held out the letter Valerius had left behind, his scarred hand trembling not with weakness, but with suppressed rage. His voice was a low growl, rougher than she had ever heard it. "This is a lie." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," she said, her own voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart. "They will come for you at dawn," he stated, "and for your father." He looked at her, his gaze piercing, pleading. All the king's power, all his strength, was useless against a perfectly crafted lie without proof. "Help me," he rasped, the words surrender and a command all in one. "Help me unmake it." This was the moment their alliance was truly forged. Not in the quiet garden, but here, in the shadow of the executioner's axe. "The library," Elara said, her mind already racing. "We need my father's letters. We need documents. We need proof." He simply nodded, then led the way, his long strides full of purpose. The library, the room she had so patiently cared for, now became their war room. Theron lit every candelabra, flooding the dusty space with more light than it had seen in years. The room came alive, ready for the battle ahead. Theron strode to a massive locked chest in the corner, a chest Elara had always assumed was merely decorative. He produced a heavy iron key from beneath his tunic and opened it. Inside were stacks of official correspondence, royal decrees, and personal letters, all perfectly preserved. The royal archives. "Everything from your father is here," he said, his voice raw. "Find the flaw." They may spread the documents across the great oak table where Elara had spent so many hours cleaning. She took the forged letter from him, her fingers tracing the elegant, familiar script of her own name. It was a masterful copy, but a copy nonetheless. A forgery always leaves a ghost of itself behind. "The parchment," she murmured, holding it to the candlelight. "It's too new, too perfect. My father's stationers use a linen blend from the southern provinces. This is northern paper. It's smoother." Theron grunted, his eyes scanning the documents. He was a warrior, not a scholar, but his gaze was sharp. He was hunting for his own clues. Elara moved on to the ink. She touched a tiny dry corner to her tongue. "The iron gall ink my father uses is bitter. This is sweeter. It has a higher concentration of wine in the mix. It's the kind the court scribes use." These were small things, circumstantial, not enough to stop an execution. She needed something undeniable. Her eyes fell to the bottom of the letter, to the blob of red wax bearing the seal of her family's house, the proud Lion of Gregor. She stared at it, her mind racing. It was perfect, too perfect. "That's it," she whispered. She grabbed one of her father's genuine letters from the pile and held the two seals side by side. To any normal observer, they were identical, but she was not a normal observer. "Look," she urged, pointing with a trembling finger. "In my father's true seal, there is a tiny flaw, a nick in the metal, just at the base of the lion's mane. My grandfather made it by accident a century ago. It's on every document my family has ever sealed." She pointed to the seal on the forged letter. "It's not there. The forger was skilled, but they worked from a drawing or a less than perfect impression. They made a perfect seal. My family's seal is imperfect." Theron leaned in close, his scarred face just inches from hers, as he examined the two seals. She could feel the warmth from his body, see the intense focus in his eye. He saw the flaw. He saw the truth. The truth, once unsheathed, is a weapon more powerful than any sword. If this moment made your heart race, don't miss what comes next. Join our community to witness the final outcome of this royal battle. He straightened up, a grim satisfaction on his face. They had it, the undeniable proof. They worked for the rest of the night, a silent, efficient team. He would find the documents she requested, his large hands surprisingly deft with the fragile parchment. She would analyze and compare, her sharp mind piecing together a timeline of Valerius's deception. They did not speak much, but the silence was now a conduit for their shared purpose. A look, a nod, a gesture was all they needed. As the first faint gray fingers of dawn began to touch the high windows of the library, they stood over the table, a pile of evidence stacked neatly before them. They had done it. They looked at each other across the candlelit chaos of their work. The warrior king and the duke's daughter, the beast and the tribute. In that moment, they were simply Theron and Elara. A tired, triumphant smile touched Elara's lips. Theron did not smile back, but the harsh lines of his face softened, and in his eye she saw a look of profound respect and something more, gratitude, partnership. A loud knock echoed from the corridor. The guards had come. Sunrise was here. Their time was up. They had their weapon. But now they had to walk into the heart of the enemy's camp and wield it, knowing that if they failed, The sun would not set before they were both dead. The walk from the king's wing to the grand throne room was a silent declaration of war. For the first time in years, King Theron strode through the main corridors of his own castle, not as a ghost, but as a monarch. He did not hide his scarred face in the shadows. He walked in the full morning light, his presence a thunderclap that silenced the gossiping courtiers and sent servants scattering. At his side, walking not behind him but with him, was Elara. She was no longer the terrified girl being led to sacrifice. She was a woman marching to deliver justice, her head held high. They entered the throne room to a scene of grim ceremony. The entire royal council was assembled. Lord Valerius sat in the first counselor's chair near the throne, a smug, proprietary air about him. Near the dais, flanked by 4 guards, stood Duke Gregor. He looked tired and pale, but when he saw Elara enter, alive and defiant, a fire ignited in his eyes. Valerius rose, a cruel smile on his lips. "Your Majesty, you have saved us the trouble of fetching the girl. Guards, take her. Let us begin the day's justice." 2 guards moved toward Elara, but stopped dead when Theron raised a single scarred hand. The command was absolute. He ignored Valerius completely, his gaze fixed on the empty throne that had been his father's. With slow, deliberate steps, he ascended the dais and took his seat. The act was so unexpected, so powerful, it sent a shockwave through the room. The beast had reclaimed his throne. He looked down at the stunned council, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "There will be justice today, my lord, but it will be mine to deliver." He then turned his gaze to Elara. "Lady Elara has brought a petition before the crown. You will hear it." All eyes turned to her. This was the moment. With a steady hand, she presented the documents they had gathered. In a voice that was clear, calm, and unshakable, she began. She spoke of the northern parchment, the court scribe's ink, the inconsistencies that proved the letter was a forgery. With each piece of evidence, the murmurs in the council grew louder, and the smug confidence on Valerius's face began to crack. "And finally," Elara said, her voice ringing with conviction, "the seal." She held up her father's true letter next to the forgery. "Lord Valerius is a meticulous man, but his forger was too meticulous. He created a perfect copy of my family's crest. But our crest is not perfect. It bears a flaw, a tiny nick passed down for 100 years. She stepped forward, presenting the seals to the eldest member of the council. "A flaw that is present on every true document from my house, and absent on this forgery." The old councilman's eyes widened as he saw the truth. The whispers grew to a roar. Valerius leapt to his feet. "Lies, the desperate fabrication of a condemned traitor. She proves nothing. Seize her." But no one moved. They were looking at their king. Theron let the chaos swell for a moment before he spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Lady Elara is correct. The letter is a forgery, but her evidence is incomplete." A flicker of hope returned to Valerius's face. "She accuses Lord Valerius of forging a letter," the king continued, his one good eye boring into his enemy. "But his treason runs far deeper than a piece of parchment." He raised his voice. "Bring in the witness." The throne room doors opened once more. A gaunt, trembling man in the rags of a common soldier was escorted in by the king's black-clad guards. He looked haunted, a man tormented by his own soul. Valerius stared at the man, his face turning as white as bone. He recognized him. "This is Corporal Wren," the king announced. "He was part of my honor guard during the final battle of the Western Campaign, the day my brother died." Theron's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "He has carried a heavy burden for many years. He has come to lay it down. Tell them, Corporal. Tell them what you told me." The soldier knelt, tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't the enemy," he choked out, his voice thick with guilt. "The fire. It was set on our side of the lines. We were paid by him." He pointed a shaking finger at Valerius. "He wanted you both dead, the prince and the king. He wanted the throne for himself. He paid us to set the fire that killed the boy prince." The confession fell like a thunderbolt. stunning the court into absolute silence. The truth was finally revealed, a horror far greater than anyone had imagined. Valerius had not just framed an honorable man, he had murdered the king's brother. He had created the very beast he sought to control. Valerius stood frozen, his mask of civility completely gone, revealing the snarling, terrified creature beneath. He was trapped, exposed, his entire world incinerated by the truth. King Theron rose from his throne, his full height and presence dominating the room. He was no longer a monster in hiding. He was a king, righteous and terrible in his fury. "Lord Valerius," he boomed, and the name dripped with contempt. "You used justice as a weapon. You used my grief as a shield for your ambition. You sought to condemn an innocent man to the darkness of the black cells." He descended the steps of the dais, each step a hammer blow of judgment. "That is a fitting fate. Guards, strip him of his titles, his lands, his name, let him be nothing. Take this creature to the deepest, darkest cell you can find. Let him live out the rest of his miserable days in the same darkness he craves for others, with only his treason for company." As guards seized the sputtering, defeated Valerius and dragged him away, Theron looked to Duke Gregor. "Release him," he commanded. The guards cut the ropes binding the Duke's hands. He stumbled forward, his name cleared, his honor restored, and pulled his daughter into a fierce embrace. Over her father's shoulder, Elara met the king's gaze. He stood tall, the weight of years of guilt and silence beginning to lift from his shoulders. Justice had been done. The kingdom had its king again. In the aftermath of Lord Valerius's fall, the castle awoke from a long, fevered dream. The halls buzzed with activity, as the rot of the old regime was cleansed. Duke Gregor, his honor restored, moved through the court, with a renewed sense of purpose, tirelessly working to mend the fractures Valerius had created. For the first time in months, Elara was truly free. She was no longer a tribute, a prisoner, or a pawn. She was Lady Elara once more, the celebrated daughter of the king's most trusted adviser. She could have anything she wanted: a position at court, a return to her family's estates, a life of peace and comfort. But as she stood in her father's newly restored chambers, surrounded by the familiar comforts of her old life, she felt a strange sense of dislocation. This world of politics and pleasantries no longer felt like home. Her home, she realized with a startling certainty, was a quiet place of shadows and silence, a place with a neglected library and a stubborn, resilient rose. She found herself drawn back to the king's wing. It was no longer a place of fear, but one of solace. She walked through the now familiar silent corridors and out into the walled garden. The late afternoon sun warmed the stones, and the air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The single rose bush she had so carefully nurtured was now covered in deep crimson blossoms, a testament to the life that could flourish even in the most broken ground. She gently touched one of the soft petals, her heart filled with a quiet, aching sense of peace. This was where she belonged. A steady footstep on the gravel path behind her made her turn. It was Theron. He was not wearing the heavy, dark tunic of the reclusive beast, but a simpler, tailored doublet of deep blue that matched his one good eye. He was not hiding in the shadows. He stood in the sunlight, and for the first time, he did not seem to be fighting it. He looked at her, and the silence that fell between them was not empty, but full. It was full of the night they had spent fighting for their lives, of the triumph they had shared, of the unspoken gratitude and respect that had grown between them. He walked slowly toward her until he stood just a few feet away, his gaze falling on the blooming rose bush. A long moment passed. He seemed to be searching for words, for a way to bridge the final gap between them. But words had never been his language. Actions were. Slowly, as if afraid of spooking a wild creature, he reached for her hand. His touch was hesitant, but warm. He did not take her hand in a grip of ownership, but gently turned it over so her palm faced the sky. His own hand, the scarred and twisted one, remained at his side. He would not offer her his pain. He would offer her his future. From a small pouch on his belt, he took an object and pressed it into her palm. It was a ring. It was heavy, made of old, warm gold, and set with a single deep blue sapphire. Elara recognized it instantly from the royal portraits. It was the signet ring of the queen. It was the ring that had belonged to his mother, a ring that had been locked away since her passing, long before his own tragedy. It was not a gift of jewelry. It was an offer of everything. It was a key to his kingdom, to his home, to the shattered, healing pieces of his own heart. It was a silent, desperate question. Will you stay? Will you be my partner, my equal, my queen? Tears welled in Elara's eyes as she looked from the ring to his face. She saw no trace of the beast. She saw only Theron, vulnerable and full of a hope he barely dared to feel. His one good eye was a clear, deep pool of emotion, reflecting her own. She did not need to speak. Her answer was as silent and clear as his question. With a steady hand, she took the heavy gold ring and slowly, deliberately, slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A long, shuddering breath escaped Theron's lips, the release of a weight he had carried for years. He raised his unscarred hand and, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. It was the first time they had touched, not out of necessity or in the chaos of their fight, but out of pure, unadorned affection. She leaned into his touch, placing her own hand over his, lacing her fingers through his. They stood together in the setting sun, surrounded by the life they had nurtured back from the brink. This quiet moment in this hidden garden was their true coronation. It was not about a crown or a throne. It was about two lonely souls, a king who had forgotten how to speak, and a woman who had taught him a new language, finally finding their way home to each other. 2 years passed. The seasons turned, washing the blood and shadows from the stones of the castle, replacing them with light and life. The kingdom thrived under the reign of King Theron and Queen Elara. He ruled with a quiet strength and an unshakable sense of justice, his wisdom as deep as his old sorrow had once been. The scars on his face remained a permanent map of his past, but they were no longer seen by his people as marks of a monster. They were reminders of his survival, of a king who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. At his side was Elara, his queen. She was the heart of the court, her empathy and sharp intellect guiding the council as much as the king's own decrees. She had brought warmth and laughter back to the cold halls, her presence a constant reassurance of the kingdom's bright future. Together they had rebuilt not just a government, but a home. The silent, forgotten wing of the castle was silent no more. It was the royal residence, filled with the murmur of life and the light of their shared happiness. One brilliant summer afternoon, Theron found Elara in the place that was still their most cherished sanctuary, the walled garden. It was no longer a secret tangle of thorns, but a paradise of color and scent. Roses of every shade climbed the walls, and pathways meandered through beds of fragrant herbs and bright flowers. It was a living testament to their love. Elara was sitting on a simple stone bench, her face tilted up to the sun, a soft, contented smile on her lips. She was watching a small boy, no more than a year old, with a tuft of dark hair and his father's serious, observant eyes. He toddled unsteadily across the grass, his small hands reaching for the bright red petals of the original rose bush, which now stood as the magnificent centerpiece of the garden. Theron came and sat beside her, his presence as comfortable and familiar as her own heartbeat. He slipped his hand into hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of easy intimacy. They didn't need to speak. They simply watched their son, Liam, as he babbled happily at a butterfly. Here was the future that had been stolen from both of them, now restored and more beautiful than they could have imagined. Here was the man who believed he was a beast, unworthy of love, now a gentle and adoring father. Here was the woman who had been cast aside as worthless, now the cherished heart of a king and the loving mother of a prince. Liam stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, looking up at them with a startled expression before breaking into a wide, toothless grin. Theron chuckled, a low, warm sound that Elara now knew better than anyone. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, his voice for her alone. "He has your resilience." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "And he has his father's strength," she whispered back. Theron looked at her, his one good eye reflecting the endless blue of the sky. The love that shone there was a quiet, powerful force, a sun that had banished every shadow from his life. He had claimed her in silence to save her from humiliation, but it was she who had filled his silence with life. She had not just healed him, she had made him whole. Together they had proven that the greatest love stories are not written with grand words or shouted from castle walls. They are built slowly, in the quiet moments. They are written in the language of warm bread left outside a lonely door, of a single nurtured rose, of a shared look across a candlelit table, of a future planted and grown in a forgotten garden. Theirs was a love forged in courage and sealed in care. If their journey has touched your heart and healed a small piece of your soul, let us know what kingdom, city, or small corner of the world you are watching from. Your stories give us life. Join our community for more tales of love that rises from the ashes, and subscribe to never miss a single one.